Good evening, friends, and welcome back. I'm so glad you're here tonight. This little corner of the world is meant just for you, a place where time slows, where history turns soft and almost drowsy, where facts fold into stories the way a blanket folds around your shoulders. So if you haven't already, dim your lights, let the glow fade into a calm hush, settle yourself under your blanket or your quilt, or perhaps just the comforting weight of whatever keeps you warm and safe. Notice the way your pillow cradles your head, the way your breathing finds a rhythm, slow and steady, in and out. Tonight's story will not rush you. It will move like a gentle stream, curling around bends, pausing where the water pools, trickling softly over stones. And if your eyes begin to grow heavy before the tale has finished, that is perfectly fine. The story will still be here, waiting, like a candle burning low in a quiet window. If this calm journey helps you unwind, you're always welcome to tap like or subscribe or even leave a small, sleepy note below, only if it feels right. Think of it as a lantern hung by the roadside, guiding other weary travelers to this same soft resting place. And tonight, we're wandering into the deserts of Egypt, though not the Egypt of mighty pharaohs and golden treasures, but the Egypt of the 19th century, when Victorian explorers, with more enthusiasm than organization, came searching for temples buried in the sand. They wore starched collars in the heat, carried maps that looked more like riddles, and, astonishingly, managed to misplace entire monuments. Yes, whole temples, slipped from memory as though they were nothing more than a set of misplaced keys. But don't worry, we won't treat this as tragedy. Instead, we'll meander slowly, smiling at their gentle blunders as we follow them through tents and tea times, through sandstorms and sketchbooks. So, with your breathing steady, your body warm, and your mind drifting, let us take our first steps into the desert night and begin. The desert, at first, does not reveal its secrets loudly. It is not a place of rushing rivers or crashing waves. It is a place of whispers, of sand sliding down the slope of a dune with a sound like paper being turned, of the faint click of beetles moving in the twilight, of the slow settling of stone blocks that have rested in place for centuries. It was into this whispering world that the Victorians arrived. Picture them now, a party of gentlemen and assistants, their figures tiny against the wide horizon, their tents flapping gently in the evening breeze. They come armed with shovels polished to a shine, notebooks bound in leather, crates for samples, and inevitably a proper tea service, because even at the edge of the Sahara, one must not miss the comfort of a steaming pot of tea. Let us wander closer. The sand crunches softly underfoot, grains shifting as though they prefer to remain exactly where they've been for millennia. The air holds a faint coolness now, though hours earlier it was heavy with heat. A lantern flickers on a wooden crate, its flame bending with the wind. The smell of kerosene mixes with the sharper scent of smoke from a small fire, and somewhere, far away, a donkey brays, reminding everyone that the desert is not entirely empty. The men talk in low voices. Their words are careful, though sometimes their certainty is not. This wall, one says, tapping it with a gloved hand, must belong to a Roman outpost. Another shakes his head, spectacles sliding down his nose. No, the style is earlier, Ptolemaic, perhaps, though possibly later. A third, who has been more focused on swatting flies than studying the wall, simply shrugs and asks when supper will be ready. And so, you see, the stage is set. For though they believed themselves discoverers, meticulous chroniclers of the ancient world, the truth is gentler and a little funnier. They were human. They misplaced notes. They confused one bend of the river for another. They mislabeled crates. And in doing so, they left us with history that drifts and shimmers like the mirages they must have seen in the noonday sun. Close your eyes for a moment and picture their camp more clearly. Tents made of heavy canvas, ropes pulled taut, wooden stakes hammered into the ground. Inside, simple cots creak as men settle their tired bodies. At one edge of the camp, a crate serves as a table, stacked with maps curling at the edges, ink bottles half spilled, quills left with their tips drying. A kettle hisses softly on the fire, steam winding upward like a ghost. The tea, when poured, is strong and slightly bitter, grains of sand occasionally crunching between the teeth of whoever is unlucky, enough to sip from the wrong cup. They laugh about it, of course. They joke that sand in tea is simply local flavor, that it gives the drink an authenticity one cannot find at home in London. Their laughter drifts upward, carried into the night, where it mingles with the stars. And those stars, so many of them, shine in silence, watching these men who think themselves masters of the past, yet who cannot always tell north from south without peering at the compass twice. The work itself moves slowly. Shovels scrape, baskets fill with sand, and the sand is carried away only to tumble back again when the wind rises. The rhythm of it is almost musical. Scrape, lift, pour. Scrape, lift, pour. Over and over, a lullaby written not in notes, but in movements. And then, a discovery. A stone block emerges, its surface carved with faint figures. A falcon, wings spread, its lines softened by centuries. The men gather, exclaim softly, make notes in their journals. One writes, "Temple, medium size, near River Bend. Condition, partial." Another sketches the falcon, though his hand trembles and the lines come out uneven. Still, they feel triumphant. They are uncovering history. Yet, tomorrow, when another wall appears, someone will wonder aloud, is this the same temple as yesterday or another altogether? The notes will not agree. One crate will be labeled Temple A, another Temple near Bend. And years later, in some museum storeroom, scholars will puzzle over these mismatched records. Temples dissolving into confusion. Whole monuments misplaced as though they were no more than socks in a laundry basket. It is oddly comforting, isn't it? To think that even in the pursuit of something so grand as the past, we can still trip over our own shoelaces, still mislay entire temples as though they were a set of house keys. But here, in this story, we are in no hurry. Let us linger with them. Let us sit by the fire, feel the warmth against our skin, listen to the murmur of men swapping tales of Cairo markets, of letters from home, of dreams they scarcely admit aloud. The fire crackles, sparks drift upward like tiny stars trying to return to the sky, and the desert hums softly around us, content to keep its secrets a little longer. The desert is a patient host. It does not mind that men arrive with tents and ropes, with crates and ambitious notes. It allows them to come, to scratch at its surface with shovels, to think they are uncovering great secrets. And then, with the same patience, it allows the wind to blow, the sand to drift, and the traces of all that effort to be softened once more. You can picture the scene, can't you? The men rise in the early morning, when the horizon is painted in shades of pale lavender and rose, the coolness of night still clinging to the sand. Their breath forms small clouds in the crisp air. Someone coughs. Someone else pulls a scarf tighter around his shoulders. The kettle is placed back on the embers of last night's fire, and the smell of brewing tea mingles with the faint tang of smoke. The voices are low, still husky with sleep. One man reads a line from a newspaper brought from Cairo. Though the news is weeks old, the others lean in, hungry for a taste of the wider world. Another fiddles with his boots, knocking the dust from them, even though within an hour they will be filled with sand again. These small rituals pass the time until the sun climbs higher and the day's work begins. Shovels press into sand again and again. The sound is steady. A faint metallic scrape followed by the soft hush of grains spilling. Men bend, straighten, bend again, the rhythm as regular as breathing. After a while, they stop speaking altogether, their movements so pracked, iced, they need no words, only the occasional sigh, the occasional grunt when a basket grows heavy. And then, at last, a corner of stone emerges. They gather, leaning close. Brushes sweep carefully. Dust curls away in tiny clouds. A pattern is revealed, a lotus flower perhaps, or the hint of a god's hand, fingers carved in relief. The men smile, wipe their brows, and scribble in their notebooks. Yet the notebooks do not always agree. One man writes, "Temple, north of river bend." Another, "Structure, possibly shrine, near sand dune." The descriptions overlap, contradict, blur. When they pack up their crates, one lid is marked Temple C, another Shrine by River. Which is which, no one quite remembers. And so, somewhere in the shifting sands of Egypt, a temple remains, half dug, half forgotten, the records of its existence scattered, like grains of sand themselves, impossible to piece back together. Still, the camp carries on. At midday, the men rest in the shade of their tents, the air shimmering with heat outside. They chew on bread gone stale, dried meat tough as leather, figs that cling sweetly to their teeth. They sip warm water, already tinged with the faint taste of dust. Conversation drifts lazily, like smoke. They speak of their families back in England, of the latest fashions they have not seen, of rumors of treasures buried deep beneath the dunes. There is always laughter when the tea is poured. The sand sneaks in somehow. Always. It crunches between teeth, makes them wince, makes them smile ruefully. Dessert seasoning, one man calls it, raising his cup in mock toast. Another swears softly, though his words are more weary than angry. As evening comes, the light grows softer, more golden. Shadows stretch across the sand, long and thin. The air cools, the world exhales. The men sit near the fire, journals balanced on their knees. They sketch what they saw, though the drawings are hurried, lines crooked, details forgotten. They label them quickly, impatient to finish before the dark deepens. Later, when scholars read these sketches, they will frown, puzzled, unsure what temple is being shown. But the Victorians do not notice. They are tired. Their hands ache. The stars above are waiting, and their blankets call them to rest. And so, the day ends. The fire burns low. The voices fade. Only the faint sigh of sand remains, sliding gently down the slope of a dune. Pause here with me. Imagine lying in that camp, the canvas of a tent fluttering softly in the breeze. The smell of smoke lingers, mixed with the sharper scent of ink and the faint sweetness of figs. You hear the murmur of men dreaming, the rustle of blankets, the occasional cough. Above, the stars gleam silently, keeping their own records far more precise than any notebook. And you, lying there, begin to drift. The desert has always known how to lull its guests to sleep. Night has fully arrived, and the desert glows under a silvery moon. The dunes look softer now, their sharp edges rounded by the pale light. The tents, too, seem to melt into the shadows, their outlines blurred, as though the camp itself is preparing to drift into a dream. One or two lamps still burn, their flames tiny but stubborn, casting long golden streaks across the sand. Inside one of the tents, a man bends over his journal, his quill scratching slowly, pausing often. His handwriting trails off as his eyelids grow heavy. The ink blot spreads like a small shadow across the page, swallowing half a word. He sighs, closes the book, and sets it aside. Tomorrow, he thinks, he will write more carefully. But tomorrow, the same thing will happen again, and the words will remain half finished, half forgotten, like so many of their notes. In another corner of the camp, a crate lies open. Inside are fragments of stone, each carved with lines of hieroglyphs. They rest quietly, piled together without much order. One lid is marked with chalk, Temple, possibly Memphis. Another crate, just beside it, says, Temple near riverbank. Yet both contain pieces of the same wall, though no one realizes it. Years later, curators in London will puzzle over this, turning the fragments this way and that, unable to make the pieces fit the puzzle. And somewhere, in the sands of Egypt, the temple itself sighs softly, content to remain only half remembered. Outside, the wind stirs. It whistles gently between the tents, carrying with it the cool scent of the river, faint and distant. It rattles the ropes, nudges the flaps of canvas, and scatters fine grains of sand across the camp. The men shift in their sleep, pull their blankets tighter, mutter softly without waking. Their dreams are filled with visions of columns rising from the dunes, of gold glinting in the sun, of forgotten kings walking silently through shadowed halls. But the desert dreams too. It has seen centuries of visitors, each one certain they are uncovering the truth, each one certain their notes will endure. The desert is patient, amused even, as it watches them fumble with compasses, confuse river bends, and misplace temples as though they were mere trinkets. It knows that time is long, and memory is short, and that what is forgotten is never truly gone. It is simply resting. Imagine now, standing at the edge of this camp. The fire has burned to embers, glowing faintly like rubies hidden in ash. The stars overhead shimmer, quiet and endless. The air is cool, almost tender against your skin. You hear only the hush of the wind, the soft exhale of the desert itself. Everything slows, softens, becomes still. And as you linger there, you realize something. It is not only the Victorians who drift into forgetfulness. We too misplace things, names, moments, little details of days gone by. And perhaps that is not a fault, but a kind of gift. For in forgetting, we create space for dreaming, for imagining, for stories like this one. The camp sighs, the desert hums, the night stretches on, and with it, the first chapter of our tale draws to a close. Now let your thoughts wander gently with me as we step beyond this circle of tents and embers. Ahead lies another vision. The desert not as a land of mistakes and misplacements, but as a vast, silent library, its shelves made of sand, its books written in stone, its whispers waiting for those who will listen closely enough. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the desert not as a barren stretch of sand, but as something quieter, gentler, almost like a library after hours. Not a modern one, with fluorescent lights and whirring machines, but an ancient hall of books dimly lit where dust motes float in the air like drifting stars and where every sound seems magnified. The hush of footsteps on stone, the faint scrape of a page turned, the sigh of a wooden chair shifting as someone leans back, lost in thought. That is how the desert speaks, if you know how to listen. The sand is its parchment, endless and delicate. The wind is its page-turner, sliding softly across the dunes. And the stones, buried and half-buried, are the heavy tomes waiting on their shelves, patient, unread, but never forgotten. The Victorians, bustling with their crates and their sketches, did not always hear it this way. They charged into the silence with chatter, with hammer and chisel, as though they could force the desert to reveal its secrets. Yet the desert prefers whispers. It prefers those who pause, who lean close, who let the silence stretch until the thought meaning rises gently on its own. Imagine walking among the ruins at dusk. The light fades slowly, and the carved walls glow faintly, their surfaces still warm from the day's sun. You trail your hand along the stone, and it is smooth in places, rough in others, as though it is telling you, I have been here long before you, and I will be here long after. The hieroglyphs stare back at you like the spines of books, their meanings half closed to anyone who does not take the time to learn their language. One Victorian scholar, let us picture him with spectacles perpetually fogged from the desert heat, once remarked that the silence of the ruins unnerved him. It feels, he wrote, like standing in a library where the books refuse to be opened. He was right, though he did not realize how right. For even when the men dug furiously, when dust clouded the air, when the sound of iron on stone echoed loudly, the desert remained unmoved. Its books stayed shut, its stories unread. And yet, if you pause, if you breathe, if you let the silence linger, The desert reveals its stories in its own way. The wind carries them, soft, almost imperceptible. A dune collapses slowly, spilling sand that whispers down like a cascade of falling pages. A column, half buried, shifts ever so slightly with the cooling of night, making a sound like a door creaking open. A bird calls across the cliffs, its cry echoing like a single word spoken aloud in an empty hall. You might wonder, what did the Victorians miss in their rush? Perhaps they missed the rhythm of the river at night, its waters sliding over rocks with the patience of centuries. Perhaps they missed the way the stars seemed to align above certain temples, marking calendars older than their empires. Perhaps they missed the laughter of children in the villages nearby, who told stories that carried truths far older than any textbook. It is a soothing thought, isn't it? That history is not only in the stones, but in the silences, in the overlooked, in the forgotten. Like an old library, where sometimes the most interesting book is not the one on the shelf in front of you, but the one missing, the gap that makes you wonder what once was there. Pause with me here. Listen for the faint hum of the desert. Imagine yourself seated cross-legged on the sand, your back against a warm stone block, your hands resting loosely on your knees. Around you, the air cools, the horizon darkens, the sounds grow fewer, softer, until the silence itself becomes a kind of music. You hear your own breath. You hear the shifting grains of sand, like tiny words brushing against one another. You hear the distant ripple of water, and you realize you are sitting in the oldest library on Earth. The Victorians, with their shovels and crates, believed they were writing history. But the desert had already written it, in silence, in stone, in stars. They could misplace their temples, yes. They could lose their notes, yes. But the stories remained, waiting, like books on shelves that never crumble. And as you lean back, eyes heavy, you might think, perhaps forgetting is not so terrible. Perhaps forgetting is simply another way of letting the silence speak. The night deepens. The lanterns of the camp are distant now, barely flickering on the horizon. The desert hums softly, steadily, like the quiet murmur of a librarian reminding you to hush. The walls around you seem to breathe. The sand beneath you shifts like a blanket, cradling you gently. And you realize you could sleep here, in this library of stone and silence, and never wake. Yet the story would continue on, carried by the wind. And so, we leave this chapter in quiet. The desert as a library, its shelves endless, its whispers steady, its books unread but never gone. Now, let your thoughts drift with me once more as we step gently into the next tale of how mislaid temples and misnamed crates led to stories as curious and comforting as a teapot forgotten in the sand. The desert's hush is not empty. It is full, like the pause between sentences in a bedtime story. If you lean into it, you realize it carries layers, like the faint hum of a building settling at night, or the soft ticking of a clock in another room. The Victorians, bless them, often filled this hush with chatter, with the clatter of crates, the rasp of shovels, the crumpling of papers. But the desert's true music, the one you and I can hear if we're quiet enough, is much slower, much softer. A dune, for example, does not collapse loudly. Its sand trickles like a whisper of parchment. The grains tumble, one after another, until thousands have slipped past, sounding not unlike the faint shuffle of pages in a library. If you sit close, you can hear it, a silky hiss, steady and soothing, as though someone is reading aloud in a voice too soft to catch the words, but gentle enough to lull you toward sleep. And the stones, too, speak. When the sun sets and the air cools, the stone blocks expand and contract. Sometimes a faint crack echoes, like the spine of a book opening after years untouched. Other times, the sound is subtler, just a soft creak, as though the temple itself is stretching after a long nap. The Victorians, stumbling through the twilight, often mistook these sounds for something supernatural, but really they were the sounds of books being opened and closed in the library of the desert. There was one night, recorded in a letter, though barely remembered, when a scholar wrote, "It seems the very stones breathe as we sleep." How right he was. Imagine lying on your cot, the sand shifting beneath you, the stars above holding steady. Then, in the distance, you hear it. A low groan, a soft pop, a faint sigh, not frightening but steady, like an old chair creaking when someone sits down with a heavy volume. The desert settling into its silence. And how many books there are here, not in leather bindings, not with gilded pages, but in carvings. The hieroglyphs are chapters, the falcons, the lotus flowers, the jackals, they are illustrations. A temple wall is a scroll unrolled across centuries. A mural is a chapter told in color and line. And yet the Victorians, eager to catalog, often noted them too briefly. Decorative elements, birds, flowers, stars, as though they were doodles in the margin. But we know better. We know that each mark was a story, each carving a voice, each symbol a word in this endless library. Pause with me for a moment. Imagine walking along a half-buried colonnade, your hand brushing the stone, dust tickling your fingertips. The air is still, heavy with silence. Your footsteps echo faintly, like soft taps in a long hallway. You stop, you listen, and you hear it. Not the chatter of men, not the rattle of tools, but the desert itself. A hush as vast as any cathedral, a hum as steady as your own breath. This is the library, and you are its only reader tonight. The Victorians, for all their blunders, sensed this too, though they rarely admitted it. In their private notes, sometimes scribbled in the margins, they confessed that the silence of the ruins was oppressive, or haunting, or too vast to describe. They did not yet have the words to call it what it was: soothing, comforting, the kind of silence that lets the mind rest. Think of how often silence is seen as emptiness. But here, in the desert, silence is fullness. It is the hum of time itself. And in that fullness, sleep comes easily. The Victorians may have tossed and turned on their cots, the sand prickling their faces, the wind rattling their tents. But eventually, the hush folded over them like the turning of a page. And so it can for you. Let the silence of this desert library drift around you now. Hear the shifting sand as the rustle of pages. Hear the creaking stones as books opening. Hear the distant cry of a night bird as the whisper of a librarian reminding you to keep your voice down. And with each sound, feel your body sink deeper into stillness. Somewhere in the night, a temple waits, its walls lined with words unread. The Victorians will stumble across it tomorrow, perhaps. They will mislabel it, perhaps. They will argue whether it is Greek or Roman, perhaps. But for now, it sits quietly in its place on the shelf, a book waiting to be opened, a story waiting to be dreamed. The desert does not mind. It has waited for centuries already. It can wait a little longer. The deeper into the desert you wander, the stronger the sense becomes that you are not walking through sand and stone, but through the aisles of an ancient archive. By day, the light is too harsh, the heat too pressing. The library hides itself then, its shelves glaring and unreadable. But at dusk and into the night, when the winds soften and the air cools, the words seem to rise from the walls themselves. A falcon carved on a lintel is not just a bird, it is a chapter heading. A row of columns is not just architecture, it is the table of contents. And the silence, that wide, steady silence, is the index that ties it all together. The Victorians, poor fellows, rarely paused long enough to read the library in this way. Their boots crunched too loudly on the sand. their voices carried too easily, echoing across the stone like shouts in a reading room. Their journals, though filled with words, often missed the ones that mattered most. They catalogued statues as seated figure, worn, when really the figure was a scribe, patiently waiting to remind them that silence itself is a kind of record. And yet, even through their chatter, the library endured. Imagine them at night, gathered around a lantern, their shadows tall against the canvas of their tents. They argue softly, quills scratching, maps spread out, fingers jabbing at uncertain lines. Here, near the bend of the river, one insists. No, here, by the dune, another counters. All the while, the desert hums in the background, its books closed, its shelves waiting. The arguments fade, the men yawn, the lanterns dim, and once again the hush settles in like a great librarian closing the doors for the evening. Enough for today, the silence seems to say. The stories will still be here tomorrow. Now let yourself imagine being alone in that vast library of sand. The moonlight spills across the dunes like silver ink. The air is cool against your skin. Each step you take is soft, leaving no trace. You move between columns half buried, each one like a book spine jutting from the shelf. You place your hand on a stone block, and it is cool now, no longer hot from the sun. It thrums faintly beneath your palm as though it remembers every hand that touched it before, every prayer spoken in its halls. You pause, you breathe, and the silence is thick and soothing, like a blanket wrapped around your shoulders. Nothing demands your attention. Nothing asks you to rush. The world is patient. The stories are patient. And you too may be patient here. The Victorians, for all their blunders, gave us this gift, a chance to smile at their mistakes, and in doing so, to notice what they missed. They mislaid temples, mislabeled walls, misplaced statues. But the silence of the desert, the hum of its library, could never be lost. It remains, waiting for anyone who chooses to sit quietly and listen. Perhaps if you tilt your head just so, you can hear it now, the faint, steady turning of pages, not in books of paper and ink, but in books of sand and stone. Each dune a chapter, each temple a volume, each sigh of the wind another story sliding softly into place. And with that, the night grows deeper, the library grows quieter, the lanterns of the camp blink out one by one. Soon, only the stars remain, glittering like candles above endless shelves. You close your own eyes, letting the silence seep into you, letting the hum of the desert carry you towards sleep. And as you drift, we too drift, onward to another chapter, where the misplaced temples of the Victorians will reappear in the most unexpected company, not alongside maps and sketches, but beside the simple domestic comforts of teapots, cups, and dust. There's something oddly comforting about the way the Victorians carried their world with them, no matter how far into the desert they wandered. They could be standing beside the ruins of a 2,000-year-old temple, yet what caught their attention just as often was the matter of tea, crates of porcelain cups, delicate saucers, silver teaspoons polished to a shine, all rattled along on camelback beside the shovels and pickaxes. Imagine the scene, a tent pitched on the edge of a half-buried wall. The air is still hot, though evening has begun to cool the sand. A scholar straightens his stiff collar, wipes dust from his brow, and then, before he so much as sketches the wall, he calls for tea. A teapot is produced, its spout chipped from travel, its handle wrapped in cloth to keep it from scorching fingers. Steam curls upward, fragrant, soothing, oddly out of place against the backdrop of sandstone blocks. And while they sipped, temples waited patiently. Columns rose quietly from the dunes, unbothered by whether or not anyone was writing them down correctly. It is almost as if the temples themselves sighed and thought, "Let them have their tea first. We have already waited centuries. A few more minutes will not hurt." The humor, of course, comes later, when you read the notes. A page filled with careful measurements, angles recorded with rulers, sketches shaded in pencil, and in the margin a blot where a cup of tea was set down too heavily. A ring of brown, perfectly circular, overlapping the base of a drawn column. A reminder that even as they uncovered history, they lived it with small, sleepy comforts. Picture the dust, too. Dust everywhere. Dust in the crates. Dust in the tea. Dust on the polished boots they insisted on wearing. Dust settling on journals until words became faint smudges. Dust curling into the corners of tents like a cat curling to nap. The Victorians waged a constant losing battle against it, and sometimes the dust won in unexpected ways. A temple half recorded, its details lost beneath notes too faint to read. A crate mislabeled because the chalk rubbed away under a layer of sand. A map folded one too many times, its lines obscured until the location of a ruin blurred into nothing more than a smudge. And so temples vanished into dust, not because they were destroyed, but because they were drowned in forgetfulness, in smudges, in mislaid papers. The archaeologists were not villains. They were simply human. Distracted, drowsy, comforted by their teapots when perhaps they should have been sharper with their pencils. Let us imagine one day in particular, the men had uncovered a doorway, simple, elegant, framed with carvings of stars. They admired it, measured it, even set up a chair to sketch it properly. But midday came, and the heat grew unbearable. Their shirts clung damply to their backs. Flies buzzed persistently at the corners of their eyes. Someone muttered, "Tea," and they all agreed. So they carried the chair back to the tent, poured steaming cups, and sat in the shade. The tea was hot, the biscuits dry, the conversation gentle. "Remarkable carving," one said. "Quite," another replied, dunking his biscuit until it crumbled. "Do you suppose it is part of a temple?" But by the time they returned to the doorway, the light had shifted, the shadows deepened, and they were too tired to resume the sketch. "Tomorrow," they promised. But tomorrow brought a sandstorm, and the day after brought rumors of another ruin upriver, and the doorway was quietly forgotten. Years later, the notes contain only a faint mention. Doorway, possibly stellar motifs, location uncertain, and thus another temple slipped into the margins of history. There is a softness to this kind of error, a kind of cozy clumsiness that feels almost domestic. The juxtaposition is soothing. Temples lost to dust, teapots still polished. History blurred in journals, but biscuits remembered in detail. These men were explorers, yes, but they were also just tired travelers trying to keep their habits alive in the middle of the desert. Imagine sitting with them now, under the low flap of the tent. The lantern flickers, casting long, lazy shadows. The teapot rests between you, its spout dripping slightly, staining the sand. You cup the warm porcelain in your hands, breathe in the faint scent of overboiled leaves, and listen to the men chat, not of temples, not of pharaohs, but of their families, of the taste of fresh bread at home, of the fog rolling through London streets. Outside, the desert library hums, its shelves untouched for another night, and you feel yourself slipping into their rhythm, tired, amused, content to let the grand ruins wait until tomorrow. Temples mislaid, teapots remembered, dust everywhere. It is history, yes, but history softened, slowed, made almost homely. And perhaps that is why it is so easy to fall asleep here. Because even among sandstone walls and endless dunes, life was still tea and dust, biscuits and laughter, small comforts tucked against the enormity of time. And as the fire outside dies down and the teapot grows cool, the men settle into their cots once again. They close their journals, smudge their notes with dusty fingers, and let sleep take them. The desert exhales, the stars blink steadily, and somewhere a temple waits, patient as ever, until someone remembers to write it down. Morning always began the same way. Before shovels touched sand, before pens scratched across paper, before anyone even bothered to glance at the half-buried stones just beyond camp, there was tea. The kettle rattled on the coals, water boiled furiously, and steam drifted upward into the still air, carrying with it a fragrance that seemed almost comic in its persistence. Even here, thousands of miles from England, on the very threshold of pharaonic ruins, the clink of porcelain was the most dependable sound of the day. Picture it, the desert stretching endlessly, a sun already beginning to burn the horizon gold, and in the middle of it all, a small group of men sitting cross-legged, pouring tea as though they were in a quiet drawing room in Sussex. A teaspoon stirs gently, chime, 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 until the sugar dissolves. A biscuit crumbles, sand sticking to its edges. Someone sighs contentedly, and only then does anyone mention the temple that peeked out from the dune behind them. By the time they reached it, the shadows had shifted, and the details they meant to sketch were harder to see. Tomorrow, they would say again. Always tomorrow. And tomorrow, of course, often brought something else. A sandstorm, or a shipment of supplies, or simply another stretch of ruins more dramatic than the one before. The smaller discoveries, the doorways and half-columns, were left like forgotten teacups on a side table. The irony is almost tender. Imagine a temple built with precision, carved with devotion, aligned to stars themselves, waiting for centuries beneath the sand. And then, when at last it is found, it is outshone by the timing of afternoon tea. The temple sighs, perhaps, settling back into the dunes, whispering, "Very well, I can wait longer." The dust, meanwhile, made certain that waiting was endless. No matter how often journals were shaken out, sand always crept back in. Grains slipped between pages, smudged ink, blurred words, until temple near river became little more than tem near riv. Entire walls vanished in those ellipses. One scholar joked that he should have brought more blotting paper, but even blotting paper, when carried through the desert, became stiff with grit. It was as if the desert had a mischievous way of reminding them, "Your notes are mine, too." At mealtimes, the dust joined in. It sprinkled itself over bread, over dates, over the butter that had melted into an oily pool by noon. The men would brush it away absently, only to discover it again in the corners of their mouths, in the folds of their collars. They tried covering their cups with cloths. They tried weighing papers with stones. Still, the dust lingered. And in that lingering, it quietly erased. There is a strange comfort in this picture. For all their effort, the Victorians were undone not by Pharaoh's curses or by thieves, but by dust and tea. Not dramatic villains, but the soft, domestic inconveniences of life. The kind of things we all know: spilled drinks, misplaced notes, crumbs on the table. History, it turns out, is not only shaped by battles and treaties, but also by someone dozing off mid-sketch, by a teapot left to boil too long, by sand sneaking into the margins of a journal. One story, often repeated, tells of a scholar who carefully measured the base of a column. He wrote down every inch, every fraction, his pen scratching furiously. Satisfied, he set his journal aside while he reached for tea, but when he returned, the page was blank. The ink had smeared beneath his sleeve, the numbers dissolving into a gray cloud. He frowned, muttered something about rewriting it later, and poured himself another cup instead. The column stood patiently in the sun, its story once again unrecorded. Let us pause here, not to scold, but to smile, for isn't that how life often is? We intend precision, but we end with smudges. We plan to remember, but we forget. We set out to measure temples, but we find ourselves distracted by the steam of a teapot. And in those small distractions, there is a kind of peace, a reminder that we are human, that the world does not need to be catalogued perfectly to be lived gently. Imagine, now, sitting with them in the shade of the tent. The kettle whistles faintly. The cups are warm in your hands. Outside, the sand glows bright, almost blinding, but inside it is dim and cool. One man sketches absent-mindedly in the margin of his notes, a teapot, not a temple. Another hums a tune from home. A third stretches out on his cot, hat over his face, murmuring that he will measure the wall after his nap. The desert listens, indulgent. The temples wait, amused. And the world, for a little while, is quiet. The Victorians thought they were racing against time, yet time was far more patient than they realized. The stones had already endured thousands of years. A day, A week, even a decade of delay meant little. What was forgotten in dust could be rediscovered later. What was blurred in ink could be imagined anew. And so, temples mislaid beside teapots became not tragedies, but gentle pauses, moments where history itself leaned back, poured a cup, and said, "We'll continue tomorrow." As night approached, the dust thickened again, swirling lazily in the twilight. It clung to the lamplight, making halos in the dark. The men coughed softly, waved it away, then bent once more to their journals. Some pages filled with numbers, others with hurried sketches, others with nothing more than doodles of cups and saucers. Outside, the ruins loomed, calm and silent, their carvings catching the last glow of the sun. And beyond them, the dunes stretched endlessly, like shelves in the vast library of the desert, holding all that was known and all that was forgotten, side by side. The camp sank into quiet again. Tea cooled in its pot. Dust settled on the journals. The men lay back, their boots left by the entrance of the tents, their breathing slow, their dreams uncertain. The temples, mislaid but never gone, slipped once more into silence. And as you rest with them, your own eyes growing heavy, you realize, perhaps the most soothing truth is this, that history, like tea, is best enjoyed slowly, even if a little dust sneaks in along the way. The longer you linger in their company, the more you notice how small comforts shape the rhythm of these digs. The men spoke often of temples, but they fussed more over teapots. They dreamed of glory, but they dozed more often than they admitted, their heads drooping over journals, their pens trailing sleepy lines across the paper. And in that inattention, history slipped away. One temple mislabeled, another misremembered, another never even drawn at all. Not because of malice, nor because of great catastrophe, but because someone was distracted by the hiss of a kettle or lulled into drowsiness by the drone of the desert cicadas. There is something soothing in this picture. It reminds us that the past was lived not in sharp edges, but in soft blurs, that even those who sought to fix it in stone and ink found themselves undone by fatigue, by tea rings on paper, by sand sneaking in at the corners. History was not lost in a single moment. It drifted off like steam rising into the evening air. Imagine now the camp at twilight, when the day's heat ebbs away and the cool returns. A pot sits on the embers, rattling faintly, its lid jumping with every bubble. The men gather around, their faces lit by the glow, their voices soft, almost too tired for argument. They sip slowly, watching the stars rise. The desert around them hums with its endless library of silence. The ruins wait, their shadows stretching across the dunes, patient as ever. One man dozes mid-sentence, his cup slipping from his hand into the sand. Another leans back, hat tipped forward, muttering of columns and capitals that will never make it into tomorrow's notes. And yet, despite their forgetfulness, there is peace here. The temples are not angry, the desert is not cruel. The world simply holds its breath, allowing time to pass, allowing memories to fade and return again in their own season. And so, another day ends. The fire burns low, the dust settles, the teapots cool, and in the stillness of the night, the mislaid temples and forgotten notes drift into the same place as dreams, a place where nothing is lost forever, but simply waiting to be remembered. Now, as the chapter closes, let us fold away the teacups, brush the dust from our sleeves, and step softly onto the deck of a boat waiting at the riverbank. Ahead lies another part of the story, not the stillness of camp, but the gentle motion of water, the winding path of the Nile, and the curious way one can travel for days with no true map in hand. The river is another kind of library. By day, it glitters in the sunlight, its surface shifting like polished glass. By night, it turns black, a ribbon of ink stretched across the land. And for the Victorians who set out upon it, the Nile was less a guide and more a puzzle. Their maps were, to put it kindly, uncertain. A bend drawn too sharply here, A village misplaced there. Distances guessed, directions blurred. They squinted at the paper, tilted their heads, argued about whether a certain temple should be upstream or downstream, and all the while, the river flowed calmly beneath them, amused at their confusion. Picture the boat itself, long and narrow, its wooden hull creaking softly as it cuts through the water. The sail catches the wind with a sigh, puffing gently. The men lounge on deck, fanning themselves with hats, muttering about heat and flies. Crates are stacked haphazardly, some marked specimens, others sketches, though no one is quite sure what lies where. At the stern, a kettle balances precariously on a brazier because, of course, there must be tea even on the Nile. Steam curls upward, dissolving into the hot air. Someone jokes that the tea tastes of river water, and another replies that at least it's wet. They laugh, though faintly, for the sun presses heavily upon them. The shoreline drifts by slowly. Palm trees lean toward the water, their fronds rustling like pages being turned. Villages appear, children waving, women carrying baskets. Temples, too, rise from the banks, some grand and towering, others half-sunken, their columns jutting like bookmarks left too long in the sand. The men squint, sketch, argue about names. "Is this Edfu?" one asks. "No, perhaps Dendera," another suggests. A third shrugs. The map, once again, offers no clarity. And so the Nile becomes less of a guide and more of a dream. They drift, uncertain, lulled by the steady lap of water against wood, the flutter of the sail, the hum of cicadas on the shore. History slips past them in quiet procession, temples misnamed, villages misplaced, but always with the same calm rhythm. For those who traveled it, the river was both path and puzzle, comfort and confusion, and for us, it is a lullaby, a reminder that sometimes it is enough simply to drift, to let the current carry us, even if the map in our hands is blurred. The first thing you notice about traveling the Nile is the rhythm. The boat glides forward, not in a rush, but in a kind of slow breathing. The sail catches, the boat leans, the water slaps gently against the hull, then a pause, then another push, over and over, steady, soothing, like the rise and fall of your chest as you settle beneath a blanket. The Victorians, though they rarely admitted it in their journals, were lulled by this rhythm. They set out with grand intentions, temples to locate, ruins to sketch, names to confirm, but soon enough, they were sprawled on deck, hats tipped over their faces, letting the rocking of the boat carry them into drowsy half-sleeps. Their notebooks slid off laps, their pencils rolled lazily across the planks, their maps fluttered in the breeze. Ah, the maps. Let us pause there. Because a map, in theory, is a promise of certainty. Lines, bends, names, dots, all meant to bring order to the wandering of rivers and roads. But the maps the Victorians carried were more suggestion than promise. Rivers that looped too tightly on paper meandered lazily in reality. Villages drawn confidently on the wrong bank left men squinting across the water, wondering whether the map was wrong or their eyes deceived them. Entire temples were marked with nothing more than a vague structure here, as though even the map itself was shrugging. So picture them, clustered around a crumpled sheet of paper, the boat rocking gently beneath their boots. One points at a line, insisting they should have passed a ruin already. Another argues that the bend of the river on paper does not match the bend of the river before them. A third shrugs, sipping tea from a tin cup, sand already crunching at the bottom. The arguments rise and fall, but the river pays no mind. It continues forward, steady and smooth, carrying them whether they know where they are or not. Along the banks, the world unfolds. Children run to the edge, waving and laughing. Donkeys bray, pulling carts of reeds. Women wash clothes in the shallows, the fabric slapping rhythmically against the stones. The smell of cooking drifts faintly across the water, bread baking in clay ovens, herbs crushed underhand. The Victorians note some of it, though always in clipped phrases. Peasants at work, women singing by river. But for us, the sounds linger longer. The songs blend with the rustle of palms, the lap of water, the faint creak of the boat. It is music without beginning or end, a lullaby the river has sung for thousands of years. Temples appear like apparitions. One moment the bank is empty, reeds tall and green. The next, stone rises suddenly, columns, gateways, half-sunken walls. The men scramble to take notes, to sketch quickly before the boat glides past. But the river does not pause for them. The temple slides into view, then out again, gone before their pencils have finished their lines. "We'll return," one says. But whether they do or not, the temple remains, patient, unmoved by their hurried hands. At night, the river becomes another world. The water turns black, mirroring the stars so perfectly that you cannot tell where sky ends and river begins. The boat creaks softly, lanterns swinging, their light golden against the dark. The men sit in a circle, cups in hand, their voices low. They speak of home, of letters waiting in Cairo, of whether the stars above them are the same ones their families see. They argue sometimes over which constellation is which, though none of them are entirely sure. The river listens, amused, carrying their voices downstream. One evening, the kettle toppled. The boat rocked too sharply, and the water hissed as it struck the brazier. For a moment, panic, no tea. But soon, laughter followed. They joked that the Nile itself had claimed the first sip, that the gods of the river demanded tribute, and so they brewed another pot, this time more carefully, balancing the teapot with stones. A temple passed quietly in the night, half seen in the lantern glow, but in their journals the only note was, "Tea nearly lost to river." Another temple misplaced, another story blurred because tea, once again, had stolen the spotlight. And yet, isn't there a charm in that? To know that history is not just battles and monuments, but also spilled kettles, misread maps, and sleepy men arguing under the stars. The Nile carried pharaohs once. It carried merchants and soldiers, priests, and pilgrims, and then, in its endless patience, it carried Victorians with their teapots and their confusion, just as serenely. Pause here for a moment. Close your eyes. Hear the lap of water against wood, steady, rhythmic. Feel the sway of the boat beneath you, rocking gently, neither hurried nor still. Smell the faint sweetness of tea, mixed with the sharper scent of kerosene from the lantern. Above you, the stars stretch endlessly, and below you, the river mirrors them, turning the world into a soft infinity of light. And you drift. The men's voices fade, the lanterns swing more slowly, the water hums. You are carried, as they were, not by certainty, not by maps, but by the simple rhythm of the river. Days on the river blurred together. The Victorians began each morning with the same rituals: a cup of tea, a glance at their worn maps, and a few muttered words about the heat that already pressed down even at dawn. They looked over the rail at the green banks, the rows of palm trees bending toward the water, the reeds swaying gently in the breeze. Villages appeared, small and quiet, smoke rising from clay ovens, children waving as the boat drifted by. And always the temples, some half hidden, some rising proudly, but always unexpected, as though the river itself liked to surprise them. "There!" someone would shout, pointing at a cluster of stone. Everyone scrambled for journals, for pencils, for measuring rods, and yet by the time they organized themselves, the temple was already slipping out of view, the current carrying them steadily onward. "We'll stop on the way back," they promised. But the way back was always delayed, always uncertain. The temples, patient as ever, simply watched them go. At times, the maps caused more laughter than clarity. One bend of the river looked remarkably like another. One sketch of a shoreline could fit half a dozen real places. They argued in the shade of the sail, sweat trickling down their faces, their voices rising in exasperation. "We are here," one insisted, jabbing his finger at a dot. "No, further north," another countered. "We've already passed that temple," a third added, though he was too drowsy to sound convincing. In the end, they often agreed to disagree and poured another round of tea, letting the river decide where they were. the mistakes multiplied. A crate labeled Temple at Bend was filled with fragments from two entirely different sites. A journal entry confidently describing a great gateway of stone was later discovered to be a description of a much smaller, half-buried shrine. Even sketches blurred together, columns drawn at odd angles, carvings guessed at rather than recorded. And so, when the crates arrived months later in distant museums, curators scratched their heads, unable to match the notes with the artifacts. Yet there is a charm in these blunders, for they reveal the humanity of it all. The men were not villains, nor careless beyond reason. They were simply overwhelmed by heat, by dust, by fatigue. They were distracted by meals, by letters from home, by the constant need for tea, and in their distraction, history slipped gently from their grasp, like sand through their fingers. At night, the river soothed their frustrations. The lanterns glowed softly, casting golden ripples across the dark water. The sail sagged gently, the ropes creaked, the boat rocked as though it too were weary. The men sat together, cups in hand, their voices hushed. They spoke of England, of fog and rain, of fireplaces and thick wool blankets. The river listened, carrying their words downstream, storing them among its endless stories. And then, as they drifted to sleep, the Nile carried them onward. The stars above glimmered in silence, mirrored in the water below. The temples along the shore stood quietly, their carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. They had seen many travelers before, and would see many after. The missteps of one group of Victorians were nothing to them. They remained, patient, eternal, like books still waiting on the shelf. The boat rocked softly. The water lapped gently. The world hushed. And as the men dreamed, the Nile whispered its lullaby, steady and endless, reminding them, and us, that it is not always the map that matters, but the drifting, the being carried, the letting go. And so, the chapter of the Nile closes not with certainty, but with calm. The maps still blur, the temples still wait, but the river carries all of it forward in its own time. Now, let us step ashore. Let us leave the rocking boat behind and walk quietly into the courtyards of forgotten gods, places where statues stand in silence, their faces softened by centuries, their names nearly lost, but their presence still felt in the stillness of stone. The first thing you notice as you step into an ancient courtyard is the silence. Not the vast hush of the desert, nor the steady murmur of the river, but a closer, more intimate quiet. The air is still, the stone walls rise around you, and you feel as though you have stepped into a room where someone has just left. Statues line the courtyard, their features worn, their eyes gazing not at you, but past you into centuries. Some are headless, some are toppled, some lean slightly, as though weary of holding their pose for so long. Yet there is dignity in their presence, a calm endurance that does not ask for attention, but receives it all the same. The Victorians, bustling with their measuring rods and sketchbooks, often treated these courtyards as puzzles. Which god did this statue once represent? Was this courtyard a temple or merely an annex? Was that carving a falcon or a jackal? And why did it matter? They argued, they noted, they labeled, yet often their guesses were wrong. Gods were misnamed, statues misidentified, entire courtyards mislabeled in their records. But for us, here tonight, it does not matter. The names can be wrong, the labels faded. What matters is the feeling of standing in that space, hearing the silence press gently around you, smelling the faint scent of stone and dust, seeing the moonlight cast shadows across the worn carvings. It is not a puzzle to solve, it is a story to rest within. The forgotten gods do not demand worship. They do not insist on precision. They simply remain, quiet guardians of courtyards where the air is thick with memory. You can almost hear them breathing, slow and steady, like sleepers who have not yet woken. And as you walk among them, you realize, sometimes it is enough simply to remember that they were here, that their courtyards once echoed with footsteps, with prayers, with laughter. Even if the details blur, the presence remains. Step softly with me into one of these courtyards. The sand crunches faintly under your feet, but once you are within the walls, the air is hushed, heavy with the scent of age. The walls rise tall around you, blocks of sandstone fitted so tightly that even centuries of wind have not loosened their seams. Shadows stretch across the ground, sharp at midday, but now, under the softer light of dusk, they blur, blending into one another like ink spreading across paper. The statues stand in rows, each one carved with care. Some have lost their noses, others their arms, still others lean precariously, propped up by the earth itself. But despite their wear, they radiate a stillness that is almost human. You feel as you walk among them, as though you are intruding on a gathering of very old friends, caught mid-conversation, who have politely fallen silent at your arrival. The Victorians saw them differently. They bustled about with their sketchbooks, peering closely, muttering to themselves. "This must be Horus," one would say, pointing at a falcon-headed statue. Another would shake his head. "No, clearly Anubis." A third would wrinkle his brow and suggest it might be a Roman addition. In the end, they often compromised by labeling it vaguely: figure, animal-headed, uncertain. Imagine the gods, if they could hear, sighing quietly. Really, after all these centuries, that's the best you can do? And yet, even in their confusion, the Victorians left traces of gentleness. Their sketches, though imperfect, captured the tilt of a head, the curve of a wing, the faint smile on a weathered face. In some drawings, the ink is smudged where a fly landed, or where the artist leaned too heavily on the page. One sketch, kept in a journal still tucked away in a museum, shows a perfectly ordinary god, except for the faint ring of tea at the corner of the page. The god looks as though he has been given a halo of brown, as if to say, "Yes, even I was present at tea time." Let us linger in this courtyard. The air is cool now, the day's heat stored in the stones, radiating gently. A bird flits across the open sky above, its wings catching the last light. Somewhere beyond the walls a donkey brays, its cry echoing faintly, absurdly, in the solemn silence. The statues do not move, but they seem to acknowledge it nonetheless, as though amused by the intrusion. You walk slowly, tracing the carvings with your fingers. They are smooth in places, rough in others, the grooves of hieroglyphs worn shallow by centuries. You cannot read them, perhaps, but you feel them, the way you feel the grain of old paper or the spine of a well-loved book. Each line, each symbol, is a word in a story too vast to be spoken aloud in one sitting. The Victorians wrote clumsily about these carvings. Decorative markings, they scribbled, or symbolic bird, unclear meaning. Yet the carvings were entire sentences, entire chapters. They told of offerings, of prayers, of processions. They told of gods who watched over harvests, of gods who guarded the dead, of gods who kept time by the stars. The Victorians, in their haste, captured only fragments, but the stone remembered everything. And perhaps that is the soothing truth of it. The gods did not mind being forgotten by name. They remained, quiet, unhurried, in their courtyards. They listened to the wind whistle through broken gateways. They watched shadows crawl across the ground, day after day. They waited as sand piled at their feet, then was swept away again. They had no need for labels, for sketches, for crates. Their story was not bound to accuracy, it was bound to presence. At night, the courtyards were magical. The moon cast silver light across the statues, making their shadows stretch long and thin. The air cooled, carrying the faint scent of river reeds. The stars overhead glittered, silent companions to the gods who had once been aligned to them. The Victorians, huddled in their tents nearby, might have slept fitfully, bothered by insects or by the chill. But the statues kept watch, their silence steady, their patience endless. Imagine lying on your back in that courtyard, the stone warm beneath you, the sky vast above. The statues loom, but not frighteningly. They are guardians, companions, simply sharing the space with you. The silence is thick, but not empty. You hear your breath, steady and slow. You hear the faint shift of sand, the flutter of wings. The gods do not speak, but they do not need to. Their presence is enough. The Victorians, in their earnestness, may have misnamed them. They may have confused Anubis for Horus, Isis for Hathor, or Osiris for some Roman figure entirely. But the gods, if they cared at all, likely smiled at the effort. For names come and go, but the stillness of stone endures. And perhaps that is why these courtyards feel so calming. Because here, in the company of forgotten gods, nothing is demanded of you. You do not need to understand. You do not need to name. You only need to be present, to breathe, to rest. And so, another layer of the story unfolds, not of accuracy, but of atmosphere. The Victorians, with all their blunders, left us sketches smudged with tea and notes blurred with dust. Yet the courtyards themselves remain unchanged, offering us their silence, their stillness, their gentle company. Forgotten gods in quiet courtyards, reminding us that memory is not always in names or notes, but in present. As the Victorians recorded what they could in their cramped handwriting, the gods seemed content to watch. A statue leaned forward ever so slightly, as if curious about the quill scratching on paper. A falcon head caught the moonlight, its eye gleaming faintly, as though amused by the mistakes being made in its name. The courtyard was a stage, and the explorers, with their mismatched hats and endless cups of tea, were temporary actors, fumbling their lines. One evening, a storm gathered. The wind rose suddenly, rattling the walls, sending plumes of sand swirling into the air. The men scrambled to cover their crates, to shield their notes, to hold down their tents. But the statues did not move. The gods, worn but steadfast, stood calmly as the storm swept through. Their silence seemed to say, "We have seen greater storms than this. You are but guests in our courtyard." When the wind settled and the night grew calm again, the explorers returned, brushing sand from their hair, from their sleeves, from their journals. Their notes for that night were nearly illegible, the ink smeared. Tingo. Pages warped by grit, but the statues remained unchanged. And perhaps, if one listened closely, one might have heard the faintest sigh of patience. There was comfort in that patience. The Victorians fretted over dates and names, over whether a carving was Ptolemaic or earlier, whether a wall belonged to a shrine or a storeroom. But the gods themselves were untroubled. Their presence did not depend on accuracy. They had been misnamed before and would be misnamed again. Still they stood, quiet, dignified, waiting for anyone who wished simply to sit with them. Imagine yourself in that courtyard now. The air is still cool from the storm, carrying a freshness rare in the desert. The sand is smooth beneath your feet, newly shaped by the wind. The statues rise around you, shadows long and solemn. You walk among them slowly, your fingers trailing over stone, your footsteps soft. You feel no need to rush, no need to name. You are simply there, in their company, resting within their silence. The Victorians eventually left these courtyards behind. Their crates were shipped downriver, their notes tucked into journals, their sketches rolled up and tied with string. They thought perhaps that they had captured what mattered, but what truly remained was the memory of quiet gods, forgotten in name but never in presence. And so the courtyards remained still, statues softened by time, carvings faded, walls worn, but the silence endures, soothing, steady, reminding us that even what is forgotten is not truly gone. It lingers, patient as stone, waiting for us to pause, to breathe, to listen. The gods do not mind being forgotten. They have already outlived countless generations, countless storms, countless explorers. They will outlive us too, and in that endurance there is comfort, for it means that nothing truly vanishes. It only rests quietly, waiting to be remembered. And so, Chapter 5 closes. Forgotten gods in quiet courtyards, their presence steady, their silence endless. A reminder that the past is not always in the words we wore, or the names we remember, but in the spaces that remain, in the stillness that welcomes us when we pause to notice. Now, let us step back through the courtyard gate, the statues bowing silently in farewell. Ahead stretches the desert once more, vast and endless, the sand whispering in the wind. And there, in its shifting dunes, lies the final chapter of our journey. For the sand keeps its secrets, no matter how many shovels strike its surface, no matter how many notes are scribbled in haste. The desert is patient. It always has been. Empires rose and fell, armies marched, merchants traded, explorers dug, and still the sand flowed on, covering what it wished, revealing what it chose, keeping its secrets close. The Victorians believed they could uncover it all. With their crates, their maps, their journals, they thought the past would yield to their persistence. And yet, temples slipped away, notes blurred, statues misnamed. The desert allowed them glimpses, yes, but it never surrendered entirely. It always held something back, a mystery, a whisper, a story half told. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast dune. The wind blows softly, reshaping the slope even as you watch. A temple lies buried beneath, its columns hidden, its carvings silent. You know it is there, yet the sand insists on keeping it covered. Perhaps tomorrow the wind will shift and part of the wall will emerge. Perhaps next year, perhaps in another century. Time means little to the desert. The Victorians dug furiously, baskets of sand carried away, only for the wind to return it the next night. Their notes, written with such urgency, faded with dust, their ink smudged by sweat. They misplaced temples not because they were careless, but because the desert wished it so. For the desert knows the value of secrecy. It knows that not every story must be told at once. And so, the sand remains the final librarian, choosing what to reveal, what to conceal, and when. It is a comfort, in a way, for it means the story never ends. There will always be another discovery, another doorway revealed, another carving uncovered. The library of the desert is infinite, and it turns its pages slowly, softly, like a bedtime story told over centuries. The longer you spend with the desert, the more you realize it is not empty at all. To the hurried eye, it is endless sameness, sand, sky, wind. But to the patient ear, it is filled with stories. Each gust of wind is a page turning. Each shifting dune is a paragraph rewriting itself. Each grain of sand is a word in an endless volume. The Victorians, with their boots and shovels, tried to hurry the story along. They dug trenches, hauled baskets, brushed at carvings. They made notes and argued about measurements. They believed the desert would yield if they worked hard enough. But the desert smiled quietly and let them dig, knowing it would cover their trenches in a single night of wind. There is a gentleness in that resistance. The desert was never cruel. It did not rage or destroy. It simply waited, patient as stone, letting time smooth away mistakes. The misplaced temples, the mislabeled statues, the forgotten notes, these were not failures. Only reminders that the desert keeps its own pace. Imagine now a group of explorers at the end of a long day. They sit at the edge of their excavation, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink. Their hands are dusty, their clothes streaked with sweat. They sip tea from tin cups, the steam curling upward into the cooling air. Before them, half buried in the sand, a column leans. They argue softly about its origin, but their voices fade as the evening deepens. Soon they are silent, watching the sky darken, listening to the hush of the wind. The desert hums around them, and they realize, perhaps only faintly, that they are not in control here. The sand has its own logic. It buries and reveals according to rhythms we cannot predict. It preserves some things miraculously: papyrus scrolls, delicate carvings, even bread baked thousands of years ago, while letting others vanish without trace. It is not random, but it is not ours to command. It is, instead, a kind of slow conversation between earth and time. And that conversation is soothing, isn't it? To know that the world does not rush, that what is hidden today may be revealed tomorrow or in 1,000 years, that nothing is truly lost, only waiting beneath the sand, patient and still. The Victorians wrote of frustration, of exhaustion, of confusion, but they also wrote of awe. Standing before a temple half covered, they felt small. They sensed the weight of time pressing gently upon them. They realized, if only for a moment, that the desert would outlast them, outlast their maps and crates and sketches. And in that realization, they found calm. Let yourself feel that calm now. The desert stretches around you, vast and quiet. The air is cool, the stars bright above. The sand shifts softly underfoot, whispering as it moves. You breathe slowly, deeply, letting the silence fill you. The temples may be misplaced, the notes may be blurred, but the desert is steady, eternal, comforting. The sand keeps its secrets, and in doing so, it offers us peace. For we do not need to know everything. We do not need to rush, to solve, to name. We can simply rest, knowing that the story is larger than us, that it continues with or without our understanding. And so, the final chapter closes, not with discovery, not with triumph, but with stillness. The desert remains, its secrets safe, its silence deep. The Victorians have gone, their tents folded, their crates shipped, their journals tucked away, but T. Santinum, Hisan remains, whispering, waiting, turning its pages slowly, endlessly. And now, dear listener, our long, drowsy journey draws to a close. We have wandered with Victorian diggers, chuckled at their misplaced temples, sipped their endless tea, drifted down the Nile with their crumpled maps, and stood in the courtyards of forgotten gods. We have felt the patience of the desert, the calm of statues, the steady hush of sand keeping its secrets. As you lie here, may these memories guide you gently into sleep. May the patience of the desert soothe your thoughts. May the silence of the courtyards quiet your mind. May the rhythm of the Nile carry you deeper into dreams. If this calm journey helped you unwind, you are always welcome to tap like or subscribe, only if it feels right, of course. And if you drifted off somewhere between the teapots and the temples, let me know below. I'd love to hear where your dreams began. For now, though, rest. The story continues without us. The sand still shifts, the river still flows, the statues still stand. We can close our eyes and let it all carry on, knowing that time itself is the gentlest storyteller of all. Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well. Good night.